In April 2026, the U.S. Energy Information Administration published a number that should have been front-page news everywhere. China entered the Iran war with 1.4 billion barrels of strategic oil stockpiled, more than 3 times what the United States held. They bought it all in 2025 at discount, while the rest of the world was selling. Here's the thing. Not a single Chinese refinery caught fire in the wave of blazes that swept 7 other countries. Coincidence is not a strategy, but preparation is. Welcome. You're now entering the incentive layer. Chapter 1. The pattern that wasn't there. I started tracking this story because of a question I couldn't shake. In the 45 days after the US-Israel strikes on Iran began, refineries and energy facilities caught fire in Ecuador, Mexico, Texas, Iraq, Australia, India, and Myanmar. Over 45 incidents globally, a jump of roughly 1,800% from the normal rate of 9 to 10 fires per year. Every single one had an official explanation: valve leaks, pump failures, technical faults. The immediate narrative was obvious: coordinated sabotage, covert operations. Someone was turning up the heat, but when I looked closer, something didn't add up. The International Energy Agency had been warning about this for months before the first fire. In their 2025 investment report, they noted something specific. Global refinery investment had dropped to its lowest level in at least a decade. Less than $30 billion spent worldwide on new capacity and maintenance. In advanced economies, the US, Europe, Australia, investment had fallen by more than 50% over 10 years. More than 90% of what little investment remained was happening in emerging markets, primarily China and India. Here's what that means in practice. A refinery is not a set-it-and-forget-it machine. It is a complex system of high-pressure vessels, catalytic crackers, heat exchangers, and distillation columns operating at extreme temperatures. These systems require continuous maintenance, valve replacements, pressure testing, corrosion inspection, catalyst regeneration. When you defer that maintenance, you don't see the failure immediately. You see it when the system is pushed. And in early 2026, the system was being pushed hard. The Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed. Global crude throughputs had been cut by around 6 million barrels per day. The remaining refineries were operating at maximum capacity, running harder and longer than designed, with supply chains disrupted and replacement parts delayed. The IEA put it bluntly: facilities were operating with higher throughput and reduced maintenance flexibility, increasing exposure to operational risk. This is where the mechanism reveals itself. The fires were not coordinated attacks. They were the predictable output of a system that had been starved of investment for a decade, then asked to perform at maximum output during a supply crisis. The clustering in time was not because someone planned it. It was because all these facilities hit their stress limits simultaneously. But this is only what it looks like at first. The most surprising part comes next. The narrative of mystery fires served a purpose. It directed attention toward shadowy actors and away from a much more uncomfortable question: who knew the system was this fragile, and who prepared for it? Chapter 2. The preparation gap. While refineries were burning across 7 countries, one major oil importer reported no fires at all. China, the world's largest crude importer. The country most dependent on seaborne oil flows through the very strait that was now closed. I found the EIA report by accident, scrolling through energy data on a Tuesday afternoon. The numbers stopped me. China had added an average of 1.1 million barrels per day to strategic inventories throughout 2025. By December, they held nearly 1.4 billion barrels. For context, the entire International Energy Agency, all 32 member countries combined, held about 1.2 billion barrels. The United States alone held 413 million. Here's the mechanism that makes this possible. China does not report its oil inventory data publicly. The EIA has to estimate based on import records, export flows, refining activity, and third-party satellite tracking. What they found was that China's national oil companies had been directed since 2024 to treat commercial stockpiles as a second strategic reserve. The line between government-held and commercial inventory had been deliberately erased. This is not normal behavior for an oil importer. Most countries maintain strategic reserves as a buffer against supply shocks. They fill them gradually, typically holding 90 days of import coverage. China was stockpiling at a rate that suggested they were preparing for something specific. They bought discounted Russian and Iranian crude throughout 2025, barrels that sanctions had made cheap and available only to buyers willing to bypass the formal market. If we remove all the complicated words, the system is actually simple. China recognized that the global refining infrastructure was fragile. They recognized that a geopolitical shock could disrupt supply chains, and they chose to prepare by stockpiling raw crude rather than maintaining refining capacity. They would let others refine. They would hoard the input. The contrast with other countries is stark. Australia holds just 38 days of petrol in reserve, less than half the IEA's recommended minimum. India's Strategic Petroleum Reserve held 21.4 million barrels as of March 2025, a fraction of what China had accumulated. The United States was actively drawing down its Strategic Petroleum Reserve, selling over 8 million barrels in the first half of April 2026 alone, with plans to release 172 million more to combat high prices. So why has this not triggered a crisis response yet? Because the fires created a narrative that obscured the preparation gap. When everyone is looking for saboteurs, no one asks why some countries were ready and others weren't. The mystery became the story. The stockpiling became a footnote. Chapter 3. Who benefits from confusion? Every system produces winners and losers. The question is whether the winners knew the game before it started. When refineries burn and the official story is accidents during a crisis, several things happen simultaneously. First, refining capacity drops, which tightens fuel markets and raises prices. Second, the narrative of sabotage creates demand for security spending, military coordination, and emergency powers. Third, countries that prepared in advance can exploit the disruption while others scramble. The IEA's data on who gains is uncomfortable. Russia, despite being under sanctions, saw crude exports rise in March 2026 as elevated prices boosted revenues. Russian LNG was being offered to Asian markets at 40% discounts to spot prices, inducing long-term supply relationships that bypass traditional channels. The United States, as the world's largest oil and gas producer, stood to capture greater market share as global supply tightened. But the most significant beneficiary was China. With 1.4 billion barrels in reserve and no domestic refinery disruptions, they could weather the Hormuz closure for months while others faced fuel shortages. They could negotiate from strength. They could choose when to release supply and when to hold it. This is where the main problem starts. The coincidence narrative, mysterious fires across multiple countries, serves China's interests whether or not they caused any of them. If the world believes in coordinated sabotage, attention shifts to security and retaliation rather than preparation and resilience. Countries invest in missile defense rather than maintenance. They build strategic reserves reactively at high prices rather than proactively at low prices. The mechanism is incentive alignment through narrative control. You don't need to start the fires, you just need to ensure that when they happen, the explanation points away from systemic neglect and toward external enemies. The fires become proof that someone is attacking, which justifies more military spending, more emergency measures, more centralized control. In simple terms, this is what is really happening. The global energy system has been underinvested for a decade. The transition to renewables, while necessary, created a disincentive to maintain fossil fuel infrastructure. Companies deferred maintenance because they expected demand to fall. Governments deferred investment because they expected the energy transition to accelerate. When the geopolitical shock arrived, the system had no redundancy. The fires were the symptom. The preparation gap was the disease, and the narrative of mystery was the treatment that made the disease worse. Chapter 4. What the numbers actually say. To understand whether this is paranoia or pattern, we need to check the numbers. Do the facts support the coordinated sabotage theory, or do they point to something more mundane? The IEA's 2025 investment report is explicit. Global refinery investment fell to less than $30 billion, the lowest in at least a decade. Net global refinery capacity was set to be almost zero in 2025 to 1.1 million barrels per day of new capacity coming online, offset by 1 million barrels per day of retirements, mainly in North America and Europe. The share of refinery investment in advanced economies dropped from 34% in 2015 to 10% in 25. This is not a system being maintained. This is a system being run into the ground. The specific incidents support this interpretation. At Australia's Geelong refinery, union officials noted a history of leaks and incidents and confirmed that some maintenance had been deferred in March 2026, weeks before the fire. At the Valero Port Arthur refinery in Texas, the investigation into the March blast remained open months later, with no evidence of sabotage reported. In India, the HPCL Rajasthan refinery fire occurred in a unit that was still in commissioning, a phase where systems are most vulnerable to failure. The clustering in time is explained by shared stress, not shared enemies. When Hormuz closed, every refinery dependent on Middle Eastern crude had to adapt simultaneously, change feedstock blends, increase throughput of alternative supplies, operate outside design parameters. The facilities with deferred maintenance failed first. The facilities with adequate investment, primarily in China and the Middle East, did not. So why has the sabotage narrative persisted? Because it is more compelling than the truth. Someone is attacking us, creates unity, justifies action, and assigns blame. We failed to maintain our infrastructure, creates division, demands accountability, and admits negligence. The incentive to believe in sabotage is stronger than the incentive to face systemic fragility. Chapter 5. What happens next? Systems do not collapse because they are attacked. They collapse because they are too fragile to withstand stress. The question for global energy is whether the current crisis will force investment back into infrastructure, or whether the narrative of mystery will continue to obscure the need for it. There are three plausible paths. The first is reactive rebuilding. As fuel shortages bite, Europe is already bracing for a severe jet fuel crunch before summer, with up to 500,000 barrels per day potentially removed from the market. Governments may emergency fund refinery maintenance and strategic reserve expansion. This would be expensive, politically difficult, and too late to prevent the current crisis, but it would address the underlying fragility. The second is accelerated transition. The crisis could be used to justify faster renewable energy deployment, electric vehicle adoption, and grid modernization. The IEA notes that clean energy manufacturing is already highly concentrated in China, which controls about 85% of solar panel supply chain capacity and 80% of lithium-ion battery capacity. A rapid transition would deepen this dependency, transferring energy security from oil reserves to manufacturing dominance. The third, and perhaps most likely, is persistent fragility. Governments declare the crisis over when Hormuz reopens, prices stabilize, and the fires stop. Investment in refining remains low because the long-term demand outlook is uncertain. Maintenance continues to be deferred. The next shock, whether geopolitical, climatic, or economic, produces the same clustered failures. The cycle repeats. None of these outcomes is inevitable. But the trajectory is clear. The global energy system has been optimized for cost and transition speed, not resilience. The 1,800% increase in refinery fires was not an anomaly. It was a stress test that the system failed. What would it take for that failure to become undeniable? Chapter 6. The Unresolved Exposure. The unresolved exposure is this. When a system is too fragile to admit its own neglect, it invents enemies to explain its failures. The narrative of coordinated sabotage protects everyone who deferred maintenance, cut investment, and prioritized short-term returns over long-term resilience. It turns systemic failure into geopolitical drama and preparation into paranoia. The constraint is attention. We have limited capacity to track multiple crises simultaneously. When fires burn and prices rise, we look for villains. We don't look at spreadsheets showing a decade of declining investment. We don't ask why one country stockpiled while others sold. We don't question whether the mystery is actually the answer hiding in plain sight. I'll keep tracking the EIA's inventory data, the IEA's investment reports, and the pattern of which refineries fail and which don't. The story is still unfolding. What system do you see that is one shock away from revealing a decade of neglected maintenance, and who do you think is quietly preparing for it?